So we have looked at what we mean by poverty, and we have seen that the worst, the most extreme forms of poverty exist almost exclusively in the global south. But what do we mean by development? And why do we consider some states developed and some not? And what do countries need to do in order to so-called develop and lift themselves out of poverty? In very simple terms, we can think of development as simply the opposite of poverty. A developed country is often seen as a wealthy one, where people are free from hunger and other forms of poverty. But beyond that, the arguments start. Very broadly, we can discern two main theories of development: the orthodox view and the alternative view. Although in reality, in fact, there are several views really. This is an oversimplification. In reality, there's an orthodox view and actually several different alternative views. But to keep things simple, we can think of there as being two broad schools of thought on development. So I'm going to give you a very simple introduction. You'll need to flesh out the details in your reading and note-taking. So first of all, what is the orthodox view of development? Well, the main influence on the orthodox view of development is economic liberalism, also sometimes known as neoliberalism, which basically means that it's the belief that free markets are the only reliable way to generate wealth. So by free markets, we mean this idea of a laissez-faire economy, in which the governments intervene as little as possible. They stay out of the economy. It's the idea of what's called a self-regulating market. So governments they have low levels of tax, they don't tax too highly, and therefore, as a result of that, they don't spend very much, they don't have much input into the economy either. They don't have too many regulations on business, so they wouldn't have things necessarily like minimum wage or those kinds of things. They wouldn't have tariffs, which is a form of tax on imports, so they'd encourage what's called free trade, where countries can trade with each other without having to pay a tax when they do so. All of these kinds of things would come under the broad rubric of free markets, a free market approach, an economic liberal approach. So for the orthodox view, poverty and development are viewed solely in economic terms. Poverty is defined as low levels of GDP, gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced in a country. And development is basically seen as high GDP, economic growth, which is achieved through what's sometimes called modernization, which effectively means a society based on the mass production of consumer goods. And this modernization is achieved by embracing free market policies. So that's basically the orthodox view of how development occurs. So if we dig a bit deeper, we can look at the orthodox view of what causes poverty. And this is very simple. Basically, the main cause of poverty in the global south is the governments of the global south, for the orthodox view. So three main things that orthodox economists would argue that poverty-stricken countries are usually doing wrong. One would be corruption, and this has two aspects. So one would be rulers, corrupt rulers siphoning off wealth for themselves and therefore diverting resources away from spending on infrastructure or health or education or other things that would develop the country and lift it out of poverty, and rather basically just thieving it and taking it for themselves and their families to enrich themselves and their families. So that's one part of corruption. The other part of corruption would be actually awarding contracts and jobs not to the best placed people or firms to do those jobs or to carry out those contracts on the basis of merit and productivity and efficiency and effectiveness and so forth, but rather giving out jobs and contracts again to friends and family members and connections and so on and so forth. So this would be one thing that causes poverty, would be the corruption of certain governments, which in turn cause the impoverishment of their people. A second thing that the orthodox view would argue impoverished countries' governments are doing wrong is perhaps failing to fully protect private property or fully implement private property laws and contract laws and so on, which would basically deter enterprise and deter investment from a country. If a country feels that its investments are not going to be properly protected under the law, then they may not want to invest there, so that can be another cause of poverty. And thirdly, basically generally following the wrong policies. So the orthodox view would argue that impoverished countries' governments are often too committed to protectionist policies, so where they, for example, subsidize certain industries, domestic industries and so on, to prop them up. And this is basically seen, according to the Orthodox view, as a waste of taxpayers' money, waste of resources. Or they have high tariffs. Again, this will be to protect their own industries against imports and competition from foreign firms. But actually the argument is that that actually reduces efficiency and makes goods more expensive for the consumer and so on. And rather than having these kind of protectionist policies, it's argued they should have, again, a free market approach, low taxes, low tariffs, limited regulation, no subsidies to their own producers and so on. So basically, it's very simple. The cause of poverty, according to the Orthodox view, is government intervention, or corruption, or not fully implementing and enforcing private property and contract law. So basically, governments failing to fully implement free market capitalism. So the Orthodox view essentially argues that the global north is rich because it has implemented free market capitalism, and therefore the global south needs to do the same. So poverty is caused by obstacles to free markets from fully developing and flourishing, whether these obstacles are lack of protection of private property or corruption or the wrong policies. So how, according to the Orthodox view, is development achieved? Well, it's pretty obvious when we look at their view of the cause of poverty. It would be by stamping out corruption, by fully protecting private property, and by implementing free market policies. So ending subsidies to domestic producers, cutting taxes, cutting public spending, ending tariffs, that is, implementing free trade, stopping taxes on imported goods, deregulating the economy, and so on and so forth. So in other words, they advocate full integration into the global economy. And they argue that if this path is followed, then the so-called LEDCs, the less economically developed countries, the countries by and large of the global south, are destined to become just like developed countries. And the influence of the Orthodox view of development has spread particularly since the 1980s with the rise of neoliberalism. It's basically this laissez-faire ideology of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were elected to power in Britain and the US in the 1980s. They began the process of converting the US and Britain to neoliberal ideas, and then those countries began to use their influence in the global economic institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to convert those institutions to neoliberalism as well. And those organizations have helped push that view throughout the world, including the developing world, the global south. So that's the Orthodox view of poverty. It's basically caused by the wrong policies of the governments of the global south, who are overly committed to protectionism and not enough committed to free market economics, and often are corrupt into the bargain. And that's the basic cause of poverty. Deal with that, and that's the path to development. The alternative view, supporters of the alternative view, reject this orthodox view on many levels. Firstly, they conceive of poverty and development in a very different way. So poverty for the alternative view is seen not simply as a lack of money, but a lack of access to certain things, and not only material things. So it might be a lack of access to clean water, but also it might be a lack of access to education or even political liberty. In the same way, development is not seen just as a matter of GDP, but of ensuring the population have access to the things they need. And again, not only material things, but things like education, political freedom and engagement and so on, literacy as well. So the United Nations, the UN, for example, has come up, and we've mentioned this before, with the concept of human development, where a country's development is measured not only by per capita GDP, but also by things such as how many people have access to clean water, education, healthcare and so on. And measuring development in this way can give us a very different picture of which countries are developed and which are not. I mentioned before Cuba. Cuba has a per capita GDP of just over $10,000. That's about $10,000 per person on average, which ranks it 137 out of the world's 229 countries that we have data for. So that's way into the poorest half of the planet in solely monetary terms. But on the Human Development Index, it comes 67 out of 188 countries, close to being in the top third of countries and classed by the UN as having high levels of human development. Because although its people are poor and don't have much money, they all have access to good quality free education, free healthcare and clean water. So by the Orthodox view, Cuba would be a very impoverished country because it has low GDP, but by the alternative view, Cuba is considered to have good levels of development, high levels, as I say, according to the UN, high levels of human development. So that's one big difference between the alternative and the Orthodox view, it is how they actually conceive of and define things like poverty and development. Second big difference is their approach to what actually causes poverty, their view on what causes poverty. So remember, the Orthodox view saw poverty as being caused mainly by a lack of free market capitalism. In other words, poor countries themselves making the wrong policy choices. Poverty then is seen as caused by mainly internal factors. There are things that are going wrong, wrong decisions, wrong choices being made within the impoverished countries themselves. For those who subscribe to the alternative view of development, this view is actually verging on racist. And let me explain. If you look at the map, remember the north-south divide. Even still today, if you look at levels, if we even just use the measure of per capita GDP, if you look at levels of poverty, there is still to this day a stark difference between, say, income levels, GDP levels of the global north and of the global south. And as I say, the people living in extreme poverty, remember defined by the World Bank as living on less than $1.90 per day, about 800 million people, are pretty much exclusively in the global south. And the Orthodox view then is basically saying that, okay, well, all these non-European countries in the global south are poor because they just keep doing silly stuff, right? They're failing to embrace free market capitalism. While all the European countries and North America and Australia, coincidentally the white countries, well, they're rich